I'd like to tell you about the absolute mess my father has created. I'm 32 years old, and I've always cherished the few things my dad, Mark, has ever given me that felt truly personal. He's not really a sentimental guy, more of a practical, quietly frustrated type who works too many hours. About 10 years ago, on my graduation, he gave me this beautiful Rolex Oyster Perpetual. It was a classic piece, heavy, understated, and felt like a huge deal coming from him. He just handed it to me in the box, said something about it being a family heirloom now, and that was it. It was honestly one of my favorite possessions, a constant reminder of a rare moment of pride from him. I wore it for years, always telling people it was a gift from my old man. It was just last week, sitting at my desk, when I got this extremely formal, weirdly polite email. The subject line was Inquiry regarding asset ownership, Rolex watch. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of. I almost deleted it as spam, but something about the attachment, a grainy old picture of the watch on someone else's wrist, made me pause. The body of the email stated they represented the estate of a deceased client, a man named Mr. Arthur Davies, and that a high-value piece of jewelry, my watch, had gone missing shortly before his passing. They were requesting its immediate return. My stomach immediately dropped. My first thought was that my dad must have lost it years ago. Maybe it was stolen, and I was somehow involved in the recovery of the real one. But the photo was undeniable. It was my watch. I felt this intense, immediate pressure, like a spotlight had just been thrown on something I thought was safe and private. I remember feeling completely confused and a little sick, knowing I had to call my dad and ask him the one thing I really didn't want to know. I called my dad immediately, my hands shaking a little as the phone rang. I didn't want to accuse him right away, just test the waters. "Hey, Dad," I started, trying to sound casual. "I was just thinking about that watch you gave me for graduation. You know, the Rolex. Where did you actually get it? You just said it was an heirloom." There was this heavy, palpable silence on the other end of the line, the kind that confirms everything you fear. He finally cleared his throat, and his voice was suddenly rough, defensive. He just mumbled something about it being a gift from an old associate who owed him a favor, insisting I shouldn't worry about it. He told me to just keep wearing the watch and forget about it. That's when I knew he was hiding something big. I mentioned the lawyer's email, trying to keep my voice level, and the moment I said the name Arthur Davies, his whole demeanor snapped. He went from defensive to genuinely panicked, saying I must have read the email wrong, that it was a scam, and that I needed to delete it right now and never talk about it again. The absolute urgency in his voice didn't sound like a man who just received a weird email. It sounded like a man whose past was suddenly catching up to him, and he was using me as a shield. I couldn't just drop it like he wanted. The watch, which had always represented his love and pride, suddenly felt like a ticking time bomb, and frankly, maybe stolen property. I started doing some digging into Mr. Arthur Davies. A quick search brought up an obituary from about 10 years ago, right around the time I graduated. He was a wealthy, well-known industrialist in the next state over, and the obituary mentioned he had run a massive manufacturing firm. Then, the realization hit me like a physical punch. My dad had worked as a foreman at that exact firm for over 20 years, only leaving shortly after Davies died. It suddenly became crystal clear that the old associate wasn't just some guy who owed him a favor. Davies was his ex-boss. My dad hadn't bought me this watch, and it certainly wasn't a family heirloom. It was very likely a valuable item taken from the estate of his deceased former employer. The weight of that gold watch on my wrist suddenly felt like a shackle, making me feel complicit in something dirty and secretive. I just kept staring at the watch, the polished steel glinting, wondering how long my father had planned to let me unknowingly carry his secret. After my digging, I couldn't just keep wearing the watch and pretending everything was fine. I ignored my dad's frantic calls, which were now just a series of angry, panicked voicemails telling me to handle my business and not drag him into it. The next communication, however, wasn't from him. It was another, much sharper email from the law firm. This time, it wasn't an inquiry. It was a demand letter. They had included dates, serial numbers, and even an internal record from Davies's company vault, showing the watch was signed out by a Mark R a few days before Davies's death, allegedly for a cleaning, and never returned. They knew everything, or at least enough to make a very strong legal case. Reading that document, Seeing my dad's name in black and white tied to what looked like outright theft was devastating. It wasn't just a matter of a sentimental gift anymore. It was fraud, maybe embezzlement, and I was holding the evidence. The watch felt scorching hot on my wrist, forcing me to finally take it off and hide it away in the deepest part of my sock drawer. I was furious at my dad for putting me in this impossibly terrible situation, but underneath the anger, there was just this hollow sadness about the total lie the heirloom represented. My father's gift was a stolen secret, and I was standing in the fallout. I knew I couldn't handle this through emails anymore. I had to see my dad face to face. I drove over to his place the following evening, the watch box tucked deep inside my backpack. When I walked in, he was trying to look busy, pretending to fix something in the garage, but his eyes were darting everywhere. I didn't mince words. I pulled out the demand letter, slammed it down on his workbench, and told him I knew Mr. Davies was his boss, and that the timeline of him giving me the watch perfectly aligned with the disappearance. I watched his face turn pale, but instead of admitting it, he launched into this loud, furious denial. He started shouting that Davies was a terrible man who had ripped him off for years, cheated him out of bonuses, and that the watch was just a small compensation for a lifetime of underpayment. He claimed it wasn't stolen. He had merely reclaimed what was rightfully his. The sheer audacity of him trying to reframe theft as some kind of working man justice was staggering. He looked me straight in the eye and demanded I give the watch back to him so he could handle it, basically trying to claw back the evidence I was holding. That's when I realized he wasn't sorry for what he did. He was only sorry he got caught, and he was completely willing to sacrifice my peace of mind to protect himself. This wasn't the strong, honest man I thought I knew. I refused to hand the watch back to him. I told him he had lied to me for a decade and that I wasn't going to participate in covering up a crime that could now seriously jeopardize my own life if the lawyers decided to press charges against the person currently holding the asset. I left his house feeling utterly defeated, carrying not an heirloom, but a heavy box of legal jeopardy and disappointment. Later that night, I did something I never thought I would do. I responded to the law firm. I admitted I had the watch, explained I received it as a graduation gift, and insisted I was an innocent party. To my surprise, the lawyer, a woman named Ms. Henderson, called me the next morning. She wasn't aggressive at all. She actually sounded sympathetic. She explained that they weren't interested in punishing me. They were just following the instructions of the estate to recover all valuable assets. Then, she dropped a bomb. She said that Mr. Davies was a lifelong bachelor with no immediate family, and the estate's beneficiary was a small, struggling children's charity that he had supported for years. The missing watch represented a significant chunk of their planned donation. Suddenly, my dad's story about getting even with a rich man for a lifetime of perceived slights crumbled. He didn't steal from a corporate tyrant. He stole from vulnerable kids. My chest felt hollow, realizing the depth of his selfishness and the sheer scale of the lie he had built around my cherished gift. I realized then that I had a definitive choice to make, and it was agonizing. On one hand, protecting my father meant being complicit in theft and actively withholding funds from a charity. It meant continuing to live a lie. On the other hand, returning the watch meant confirming his crime and potentially exposing him to legal trouble, which would fracture our already strained relationship, perhaps permanently. I spent a sleepless night staring at the watch box, the weight of the moral decision pressing down on me. I thought about the decade I had worn it, the pride I'd felt, and how worthless that pride was now. It wasn't a symbol of a loving father. It was a symbol of his deceit. The morning after my conversation with the lawyer, I packaged the watch carefully, including a short anonymous note confirming that it was an asset of the Davies estate and that the holder was unaware of the circumstances of its acquisition. I didn't tell my dad what I was doing. I simply shipped it to Ms. Henderson's office via insured, traceable courier. The relief of getting that physical object out of my life was immense, but it was immediately replaced by a deep, terrifying silence. I had made my decision, but I knew the true consequence. The end of the relationship I thought I had with my father was yet to come, and the waiting was almost unbearable. A few days later, the official notification came. The watch had been received and logged by the estate, and the matter was considered resolved on their end. Ms. Henderson even included a brief, polite note thanking me for my honesty and confirming that the full value would go to the charity. It was a small victory for my conscience, but it felt incredibly heavy. As expected, the fallout with my dad was immediate and absolute. He called me, not to ask, but to scream about the watch, demanding to know what I had done with his property. I simply told him the truth. I returned the stolen item to its rightful owners. He didn't respond with reason. He responded with an emotional shutdown. He accused me of betrayal, of choosing strangers and lawyers over my own father, and of ruining his life. The conversation ended with him hanging up, and he hasn't spoken to me since. It's been weeks of absolute silence, and honestly, the quiet is deafening. I lost the watch, the symbol of my father's pride in me, but I also lost the illusion of who he was. The pain isn't about the watch itself. It's about mourning the dad who I thought gave me a genuine family heirloom, and coming to terms with the reality that he was just a desperate, dishonest man who used me to hide his crime. I wear an empty wrist now, and every time I look at it, I remember that sometimes the hardest thing you have to give back isn't an object, but the naive trust you had in someone you loved. The whole situation has left me wondering if it's possible to ever really trust him again, even if he decides to finally break the silence.